time now would be good.
Great.
Thank you so much for doing
Sure,
this.
of course.
Incredible.
Vietnam got me into journalism, really. My last year in the Navy, I worked in the Pentagon and saw the lies. I would see the top secret reports about the bombing in Vietnam, and then all the brass and the Secretary of Defense would be out saying it's going wonderfully, and the reports would show hundreds of sorties and very few hits. Well, the distrust you had to have when you saw that they weren't telling the truth. And then when I was in high school, I worked as a janitor in my father's law firm, and would go in at night and look at the papers, and then finally the disposed files, and it was very clear the people in this small town had much more, they all had secrets, and the secrets were in the disposed files in the attic, not as they presented themselves in this small town, Wheaton, Illinois. I think it's, that's a strain of it, accountability, but also to find out really what happened, what the truth is, and of course, that's hard, that takes time, and there are layers to it. My last year in the Navy, working in the Pentagon, seeing the lies, but having a subscription to the Washington Post, and you could see that this was an energy source, and there were stories that there was an editor named Ben Bradlee who was running the show and was determined to dig into not just the Vietnam War, but everything that was going on. I had heard about Ben. I don't know whether I'd read something, but you would pick up the paper in this period. This is 1970, and not always, but frequently the Washington Post just vibrated. You could see they were digging and skeptical. Was led, you could see that there was some force, some idea behind this. Going to law school, I was 27, so I get out at age 30, and that's the end of life. And so I tried to get a job at the Washington Post. They gave me a 2-week tryout, which I failed, but told the Metropolitan editor, thank you, and he said, you failed. Why thank you? And I said, this is what I wanted to do. Again, the newsroom has that energy, that sense of we're working to find out something real. After working for a weekly paper for a year and doing some stories that the Post had to follow, they hired me, but the last hurdle is an interview with Bradlee. And it was known that he could say no. He generally said yes. Went in to see him. There was some renovation going on at the Post at that time, so he had a very small office, dark office, one lamp in the corner, and he didn't want to ask me about journalism or the newspaper I'd worked in. He wanted to talk about the Navy, because the Navy was the beginning of his activist life. He wanted to know what the Navy was like for me, and so we shared stories. He'd been on a destroyer in World War II. I'd been on one of the advanced guided missile frigates, and we talked about it's a hard life, the Navy. And as we we bonded over that. I suspect there were not many people coming in to work at the Washington Post who'd been in the military. He, the whole idea was the intensity of Navy life aboard ship is almost like nothing else, and we agreed that after the Navy, everything is easy. And not necessarily journalism, but you could see that what was unspoken is the intensity that you live aboard ship at sea, watches all the time. I was a communications officer. Things were always breaking, going down, so you never sleep, really. You are there for weeks. He was in combat, I was not. I was on a ship off the coast of Vietnam. But it was about the Navy, it wasn't about journalism. I think it's about level of effort. He always wanted to make sure that that you never get to the bottom of anything, and so there's more to find out. And the Navy is survival, particularly for him in combat in World War II. And in a sense, he was saying, this is survival. We're taking this seriously. As he said in his memoirs at one point that it's an amazing line. He said his love for the Post, his devotion to the Post, was the way a man should be devoted to a woman. Total commitment, the joy, the common goals, and that's the way he presented himself. In the Navy, you learn that you have to question authority, even though the captain runs the ship. That you have to be skeptical. Things often just don't work or are misguided, and the real functioning of a ship comes from the bottom up, and so you bring that. It's more than skepticism. It is a level of distrust about the authority. You have to obey it. You can argue with it, and I in the Navy was a subversive. Ben made it clear he was a subversive in the Navy. But Ben was not a military person. I certainly was not a military person. All my time in the Navy was pushing back against it. I had the night police beat, but I was so liberated being out of the Navy, working at that newspaper, so I had to go down to police headquarters 6:30 to 2:30, and I'd go home and sleep, but I'd come in 10, 11 o'clock and look for follow-up stories or take assignments, and so I was pretty much working all the time, and the freedom, I call it running room. It was almost a motto that Ben had. You have running room. Go dig into things. Go find out. We did a series of stories. I had a source in the health department who gave me the reports on inspections of restaurants, sanitation inspections. And of course, the most expensive restaurants in Washington had the worst sanitation, including Ben's favorite restaurant, Chez Camille. And we got the report and we ran it on the front page, and there was no kind of buckling. There was no kind of, oh, that's my favorite restaurant. We've got to give them a break. there was, again, that sense of, we'll listen to people, we'll be fair, but no one gets a break. No one, even the owner of this restaurant that Ben knew quite well. It's pressure also. When you have freedom, you realize you've got to try to get to the bottom of things, and that was the expectation. Early in that period, I remember I did some police corruption stories, and there was a story about an investigation, and Ben just walked over to my desk. I really had not had much dealing with him in those initial months, and he sat down, he said, "We're leading the paper with this story. Tell me about it. Give me a fill. Where's it coming from? What are the police up to? Is there corruption there?" And it was a minute and a half, but he wanted to assure himself that it was solid. He also wanted to communicate the work you're doing is important. You could almost, physically it didn't happen, but psychologically, when there was good story, Ben was kind of running around faster, almost dancing. But he wasn't a dancer. He had a nice sweater, and he would carry that swagger stick around, and it wasn't a show really, but everyone in the newsroom was watching it. What I think we were trying to do is make it better for Ben. You're writing clearly for the readers. Some of the stories are routine, but there was that sense of, okay, the bar's this high, well, we're going to make it higher. What about this? What about that? What's really going on? That was the question. Other editors, reporters asked that, but Ben was the spirit of dig deeper. Obviously, we haven't seen everything. Effectively, for me, saying it's in the disposed files in the attic of your father's law firm. That's where you've got to go to find out what is really occurring. I remember those first months working at the Post. It was the lunch hour, and somebody called and said, "There's somebody downstairs who says they have a story. That person works in the Pentagon." And I was the only, Woodward, go talk to him. So it was some Air Force intelligence guy who had a story. I mean, talk about something that it was bracing. He said, "We have a secret way to communicate with the prisoners of war." And so I asked him about it, called the Pentagon, asked about it. Well, this is a hell of a story, and got details, as Ben would say, wiring diagrams. So I'm calling people, trying to find out more, and Bob Ellsworth, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, walks into Ben's office, and I'd seen Ellsworth around the Pentagon when I worked there. What's going on? And there's an animated conversation. And then I'm called in, and I barely knew Ben. Ben called me in. Oh, wow, what have I done? Good, bad? And he was mad. He said, "What the fuck are you doing?" And I said, "Well, this guy came in with this story." And he said, "We're not running that fucking story." And I learned for the first time, he was a patriot. He said, "Look, this story is a secret. There's nothing illegal about it. The idea that we can have some secret communication method with the POWs, and it was ingenious what they did. I think I actually shouldn't talk about it now, even 45 years later. that, and it was kind of, well, why are you asking about this? And I said, I'm asking because somebody came in. And, okay, that's what we do. We accepted it. But I realized, keep the inquiry going. Doesn't necessarily mean we're going to run it. Ben had a way of finding that line. I saw it most clearly. It was in early 1977. Had the story about King Hussein of Jordan being on the CIA payroll. And it was, I called the White House. Carter had just become president. His press secretary, Jody Powell, said, I remember vividly the code word for the operation of paying Hussein was called no beef. And over the phone, I mentioned that to Powell, and he said, no shit, and said, you and Ben Bradlee come see the president tomorrow morning. So we went in with the story, and Carter was quite open. Off the record, he confirmed it. Said they hadn't told him about it. That was shocking to Ben. But then Ben said, if we publish that story, will it harm the national security? And Carter said, no, it won't, but I still don't want you to run it. And Ben, when we walked out, said, look, the President of the United States just said it will not harm the national security. Yeah, he'd prefer we not run it, but that's the line. Are you really harming the national security? When the president says you won't, it's almost a green light. We waited 24 hours and published the story. Carter was quite furious. I think people in the White House were furious with Carter that he had confirmed it and talked about it even off the record. Normally, everything gets shut down. But I remember that going to see Carter and Jody Powell with Ben in the Oval Office, and Carter just, not even a month been president, and he said, oh, during the campaign we were so busy we never saw any movies. And so here the other night we saw All the President's Men. And he was all kind of, I want to talk to you, I want to deal with you, message, I'm not Nixon, I'm not going to be like Nixon. And so he was open. And of course, when we ran the story, there was a big hubbub, and Carter finally said to Jody Powell, his press secretary, you call Ben Bradlee and tell him, fuck you. He was that close to John Kennedy, and conversations with Kennedy demonstrates that. Of course, as we learned a long time ago, the public, that JFK had affairs, had relations with other women. And I remember asking Ben about that. And I said, what about that? And he said, I'm telling you, I did not know. And he made the point, you can be close to somebody. He said, if your best friend is having an affair, are you going to know about it? Not necessarily. And he insisted he did not know. Now, was he suspicious? Was it possible? Don't know. But the standard of do you know, do you really have good evidence, had not been met. It was a different era, but again, I was quite sympathetic because you just don't know that. Even if you're really close to someone, there may be locker room talk and things but no one's going to say, oh, by the way, as Ben would say, I'm walking off with somebody here. I mean, he just, I understand that it would not happen, and it certainly would not be an avenue of inquiry in the 1960s that you would make. Ben was troubled by his relationship with JFK, and then as a journalist, but like all journalists, he found a way to leverage that relationship to his advantage. He clearly got scoops, got information, had an understanding that probably few people had. I can see that his behavior was quite reasonable, frankly, but you know, I don't know the details. You say we'll never know. People say we'll never know. Maybe there's a secret diary that somebody kept or something. As Ben always said, the truth emerges slowly, often, sometimes decades later. So will that become clear? I don't know. I think if Ben were working the story about somebody else, he would keep at it. It's a navigation problem like none other. And you need to be close to people and have relationships, but you've got to make clear you're a reporter. And there are many examples of people I've known who've been friends I've spent a lot of time with, and then I've written material in the Washington Post or in books that they have disliked intensely, and that's the end of the relationship. But I've always tried to make it clear, hey, this is who I am. I can't all of a sudden not be a reporter if it's something going on that describes what's really happening in the government, particularly the White House. You are trying to get information, do your job, but you're letting somebody have their say, sometimes in excess. But that's the nature of the transaction. And I'm not worried about it as long as you make it clear, hey, this is who I am. And you have meetings, you have lunches, you do all kinds of things with people, and out comes the notebook or even the tape recorder with their permission. So nothing is masked in that relationship. I think people in government at times, even presidents, think, well, you've spent so much time on this, and just like you know, you're nodding and oh yes, you know, that, and that is taken for approbation, for approval, and you're nodding because, hey, that's a good story. I like that information. There is a distance you're going to have from people as a journalist. I think Ben realized that, and I never found, I mean, he, if anything, with presidents after JFK, he kept his distance. Frequently, people would say Ben, part of the establishment. Actually, he wasn't. He was an outsider, and preserved and worked hard at keeping that outsider status so no one would get a break unfairly. And his relationship with Katharine Graham, lots of her friends would be subject of stories in the Washington Post, and they would complain to her, and she would pass the complaint on to Ben, and as best I could tell, the wall went up. Hey, look, you know, we're going to do it, and it would cause, I think, Katharine Graham some consternation. I know that. She would told me that. Katharine Graham lived about 2 or 3 blocks from where I live. And it was sometime in the 70s, Sunday, she called me over and said, "What do you think of the paper?" And I said, "Well, I think a lot of things are good, but I think there's a lot of weakness in the reporting." And she said, "Yes, I agree." And she was quite down on Ben in the paper. And she said, we're talking between us, and I said yes. And so I'm sure I amped it up a little bit, because you can always criticize the Post. And I did. I kind of unloaded and thought, I was being honest with the ultimate boss. Then a day or two later, she called me, and I so remember, she said, "Bob, I'm so sorry." "Why are you sorry?" And said, "Well, Ben and I were having a discussion and kind of a fight, and I said to him, even Woodward thinks the paper stinks, or that there's this defect in the reporting." I thought, oh boy. And so I called Ben, and he was, I'm sure this had happened 1,100 times before, where somebody had unloaded, and so we met. I remember going to his house and going through the paper and the reporting, and he listened and he kind of took it all in, but there was no recrimination because he knew Catherine went around and sucked people in to criticize the paper. And I think, at least in this case, I was astounded he didn't take it personally. It was kind of, okay, more information, more critique. People have criticisms of the paper, but there was a little ice in the discussion with Ben about that, but it melted. And I thought it was kind of the classic Graham way of managing, of going around and getting the dirt on Ben and the paper. And it was their way of raising the bar, her way of raising the bar. And I remember once he told me, he said, part of this job, being editor, is learning to manage the Grahams. I think at core, she was a subversive herself. And she, yes, the establishment figure, but she liked raising hell. And I think she used Ben as much as he used her. Well, they used each other, but when she called me up that Sunday, she was voicing some distrust. And what is fascinating and powerful about it is, now who knows what was going on inside of Ben? And of course, this is a subject for 10 psychoanalysts on all kinds of subjects, but he just kind of weathered it and dealt with it, and then he made me the Metropolitan editor, and I think it was kind of his way of saying, okay, it's hard, and everyone's going to be shooting at what you do, and you go ahead and try it. And of course, I was unsuccessful at that, and he knew, ultimately, if you want to understand Ben, he knew how to protect himself. And those protections were to be aggressive, yes, manage the Grahams, assure himself about stories as best he could. But as he once told me, he said, I can't go out and do the reporting for you, for my reporters. They have to do it. And so it was, yes, it was a platonic relationship, but she could bust him. There are turning points in Ben's life as editor, clearly. And there's a point in his memoir after Watergate, after Nixon leaves, he said quite openly, said, after Watergate, I made sure, after I heard the official version, then I could start working on the truth. What he means is, okay, the official version of anything is likely to be BS, and so take that as a starting point and go to work. He says in his memoir that there were rumors that the Times had a big blockbuster story, and he and people at the Post made efforts to find out. They'd moved out of the newsroom to a hotel and couldn't find out what it was. And it makes one of the classic points about himself. He said, you know, it's bad enough when you get beat, but when you have to wait knowing you're going to be beat, that's unbearable. And I'm sure I was not around then, but it clearly was a moment, but it was catch-up. He didn't like to play catch-up, and the Post did a great job on it, and the decision to run it by, again, subversive Katharine Graham, contrary to legal advice and so forth, was a big deal. It was, again, one of those turning points for him, obviously, but you knew it was catch-up. Ben had a group of reporters at the Post, Murray Marder, Chell Roberts, who were very experienced in this, and they were able to help him find the line, or they found it themselves, and the New York Times was publishing this. New York Times was ahead on this story. They'd worked months putting together the tale, and so it was, in a sense, an easy call. I think institutionally, getting Katharine Graham to say, go ahead and publish, was an important moment. The New York Times was premier, and that was a way to measure yourself. On the Pentagon Papers, I just thought of this story, and this is a lesson. The Pentagon Papers was the summer of 1971. I was working for this weekly paper in Maryland, and I had a friend who was a clerk in the Supreme Court, and he told me that the Post and the New York Times were going to win the case. And I thought, wow, this is new. This is before it came out. So I just walked over to the Post, and that's when you could walk in, and tried to talk to a couple of editors and say, hey, I know what's going to happen, or I have a good source. And everyone kind of looked at me like I was mad and crazy. I never saw Ben or anyone. I was hired 3 months later, not because of that. But it was a really important lesson. Take those phone calls. When the person walks in and says, I have a story, always listen. Because if they listened to me and then worked the case, now maybe they wouldn't have ever run a story saying, oh, hey, by the way, we're going to win when we're a party in this case. But here I was literally walking around the newsroom looking for somebody to listen to my story, and no one would. I came after the Pentagon Papers, and I was intensely focused on the stories I was working on, and it got to understand what it was like then at the Post. There was a lot of space that actually had levels of editors that were terrific, very experienced. Len Downey was a city desk editor, went on to become the executive editor, and they were good. And so if you came in with stories, my rule, and I pass this on to people, is get there an hour or two before the editors do in the morning and start calling around, or go someplace and then say, I have this story I can do, I can finish it by deadline, or if you'll give me 2 days on it, I think it's really a good story. And they were delighted to have somebody leaning into the news or possible stories. And so you could do lots of stories. I've never gone back and counted, but I know I did dozens and dozens of stories, front page stories on this or that I ran into. And this is the running room that Ben gave you. Nothing was off limits. You were told you could, as a police reporter, if you have to call the White House, go ahead and call the White House about something. Just tell the White House correspondent that you've done it. There was always a story. I've worked on a weekly paper, so you had to hold things. There was a story every day. I remember coming in one weekend and just kind of, this was my life. I wasn't married, I had no family, no really serious girlfriend in town. And I remember literally walking in on a Saturday night and saying, any stories? And, well, no, nothing. And so, and somebody mentioned to me, oh, they're digging on Connecticut Avenue for the new metro, the subway system. And, okay, so I went over there and went down in the underground and talked to the people who were working, and wrote a story about this group of people who were digging under Connecticut Avenue, and it was on the Metro page, and it was, it was a feature, but it told you something about, so that immediate connection to the real world and the paper, it only took a couple of hours often, if that. So everything was, go walk, listen, call the White House, just do it. I think the first front page story I had was from Night Police. 4 children were killed in a fire. And it's the first time I'd seen a dead body. And I went to the scene, and it was awful, and talked to the mother and people about it. And then I came in the next morning, and is there any follow? Well, no one was saying it. And someone mentioned, well, see if this was a rented apartment, were there code violations in the apartment? Okay. Another front page story the next day, massive code violations in this apartment. Message, there's always a follow. And you either think of it yourself, and again, the editing culture at the Post was, hey, look at this, what about this? Is this happening? And of course, Ben's chief question always was, what about the CIA? What is the CIA up to? What do they know? What is really going on? Who are these people? And of course, Ben came from covering JFK and the Bay of Pigs and Cuban Missile Crisis and so forth. And he knew that the CIA had, that question, what about the CIA, was, again, almost one of those mottos from him. He recognized the possibility of a conspiracy. And of course, Watergate was a real conspiracy. In a sense, Ben's disposed files were in his head. And that is, okay, they're saying this. It may be the opposite, or it may be there's more there. There's always a follow. The truth emerges. It was a way of looking at the world. It wasn't angry, and it wasn't necessarily cynical, but it was kind of, what don't we know? What don't we know? And of course, in that era, I think even now, what we don't know is massive. Saturday morning, June 17th, 1972, city editor called me. It was one of the most beautiful days in Washington, and the editors kind of said, what is this story? Who would be dumb enough to come in on this beautiful day? And my name was at the top of the list. City editor said, go to the courthouse, local courthouse, for the arraignment where they bring the burglars in. So I sat in the front row, and the burglars had business suits. I'd covered night cops and cops for 9 months, never heard of or saw a burglar in a business suit. The judge asked the lead burglar, James McCord, where did you work? And McCord went, and the judge said, speak up. Where'd you work? And McCord whispered, CIA. And the judge, say it so I can hear you. And so McCord finally said, CIA. And in the front row, I kind of blurted out, hopefully under my breath, holy shit. And burglars, business suits, CIA, went back and told the city editor, and it all kind of was, in a way, the CIA. This was the beginning of my knowledge of Ben's inquiry. What's the CIA up to? What are they doing? Then Carl Bernstein and I came in. We were the only ones the next day, a Sunday, and discovered, not through our own reporting, but by the Associated Press, that James McCord had been head of security for the CIA and was head of security for the Nixon re-election committee. Well, you can distance yourself, as the Nixon re-election committee attempted to do, but only so far. And this was one of those things where you're going, not just holy shit, but wait a minute. How could the head of security be doing this all on his own? Of course, which was the line they were peddling, and it was absurd. It was Gene Bashinsky, night police reporter, who had fabulous relationship with the cops, and the evidence they'd taken from the burglars they had, and Bashinsky went to see it, and the entry into the address books, one of them I think was W House-H Hunt. Another was White House, or just W.H. Howard Hunt. And so he passed it on to me on Monday. And what's this? Carl Bernstein likes to joke, W House could only mean one of two things, the whorehouse or the White House. And I called the White House and just asked for Howard Hunt. Operators friendly, it was a different era. Oh yes, well he might be in Mr. Colson's office. Chuck Colson, Nixon's special counsel, celebrated hatchet man, what's going on here? So I got Hunt on the phone and just said, why is your name in the address books of two of these people caught in the Democratic headquarters? And he screamed out, "Good God," slammed down the phone and left town, went into hiding. Now, this was an important moment, but I can have your name in my address books and go do something that doesn't mean you're part of it. So this is when I called Mark Felt and asked, what is this? And Felt's, could it be innocent? And he said, it's not. That this is a substantial connection. And that was the kind of, okay, now we really have a story. And, here it was, connection right to the White House the second day. You can now listen to the tapes of Colson and Nixon talking about this, and the Washington Post is trying to draw some connection, that the Washington Post, it's all their fault, and at the same time saying, hey, we got a little bit of trouble here. Of course, the atmosphere at the time was the White House can stiff anybody or anything, and so there was not this kind of hand-wringing, or at least you couldn't hear it on the tapes. They were going to manage this, they were going to use it, but for Carl and myself, it was, wait a minute, CIA, White House, good God, there was a I am packing my bags quality to Howard Hunt's voice that I think I'll remember for the rest of my life. And, why is he slamming down the phone? Why is this a surprise to him? And then Mark Felt's very clandestine, hey, this is a big deal. Now in the memoirs and in the tapes, you can see that Felt was talking to Dick Helms, the CIA director, about Howard Hunt. When I was in the Navy, the chief of naval operations sent me over to, I was a courier with documents that were all sealed up. I don't know what they were, to take to the National Security Council, and I was there waiting one day, and there was this white-haired man sitting next to me being forced to wait also, and like two strangers on a long transatlantic flight, we started talking. It was Mark Felt, who was in a very key position in the FBI at that point. And so I took his phone number and talked to him more kind of as a career counselor, because I was, law school. He'd gone to law school. He'd taken some classes at George Washington University as I had, and so it was just a phone kind of mentor, the person being the mentee, me, and then when I went to work at the Post, that's when I started using him. And he was not the classic whistleblower. He was not a volunteer. He was really a recruit, at least as I saw it, that I would go to him and say, what about this? The first real business we did was the assassination attempt on George Wallace, which was a month before Watergate. And the FBI was convinced Arthur Bremer, the would-be assassin, had acted alone. And so when I could call Felt about this, it was in his interest to get some stories out that this was Arthur Bremer acting alone, and he'd stalked Nixon, and I did a story. Felt was very helpful, gave me some good stories that fit together, were new information, and of course served the FBI purpose of, hey, this was not a massive conspiracy. We did some stories about a general accounting office investigation into the funds, but the real story was August 1st when Carl went to Florida and found the $25,000 check that had been deposited in the bank account of another one of the Watergate burglars, Bernard Barker. And this was Carl at his best and strongest. I mean, he was just barging into this investigator who had the check and literally called me that night. I was at the Post and said, you know, there's this $25,000 check made out to Kenneth Dahlberg. And what is it? And so, who's Kenneth Dahlberg? Nothing in the clips. This is an era when no Google, no way to search anything except in the library, and one of the librarians looked for photos and found a photo of Dahlberg and Hubert Humphrey together. So, okay, this is Minnesota. So I got them, literally, we had the Minneapolis phone directory out, and there was a Kenneth H. Dahlberg, and I called him and asked why his check had gone into the bank account. And Dahlberg was kind of forlorn and kind of said, well, again, it's one of these people who's not a volunteer, but a recruit. What happened? Well, I gave the check to Maurice Stans on a golf course. Stans being the chief fundraiser for Nixon. And we put together that story, and the city editor, Barry Sussman, I remember it ran in the middle of the front page. It was the night that George McGovern had kicked Eagleton off his ticket, Eagleton running as vice president. And Barry Sussman turned to me after we finished the story and said, we've never had a story like this before. There was a kind of anxiety that we could be, but no one, people didn't believe Nixon or the White House. They were Nixon's too smart to be involved. There was very much the conventional wisdom that had permeated. And then Howard Simons, Ben's deputy, the managing editor, was always calling us in, and the city editors, Metropolitan, you know, where are we on Watergate? Let's keep going. And this is a lot of retrospective knowledge. People knew it was big, but didn't know it was big. Yes, it was. No, it wasn't. And the approach of reporters at the Post was not to, like Carl, to go to Florida and go get the check. And and we were kind of, that's what we did. We went places, knocked on doors, and as best I can recall, I guess there was some, later came out, I mean, we got to take the story and give it to the national staff, but it never, I didn't feel that our position as the lead reporters, excuse me, I didn't feel that our position as the lead reporters was in jeopardy. There was a clear sense of keep going on this story. But what was interesting, and this is a editor, managers has to weigh when to be involved to encourage people, but also not to tamper with what they call the regular process. And Ben wasn't tampering at this point And I don't recall any specific conversations with him. The one that really rankled Carl, didn't upset me too much, was about Howard Hunt investigating Teddy Kennedy. And we had some intimations of that. We went to the Library of Congress looking for books that the White House might have checked out. And we had kind of a story, and we showed it to Ben, and clearly was sensitive about the Kennedys. And we really didn't have it. And I remember slapping. He said, you know, you don't have it. You don't have it. Didn't mean we're not going to run it. It meant you haven't convinced me, and I think we ran this story inside. He ran the story inside the paper, and of course it turns out that they were doing all kinds of things on Kennedy. As we later learned, it was the right trail, but we didn't have it, and Carl kind of felt we were further along. It was weak at that point. We had regular stories. Sometimes they'd run on B-36. I remember about an expensive receiver that the burglars had in their monitoring post across from the Democratic headquarters, and it was $3,500. And we wrote a little story about that, or actually a long story. And of course, what it meant, quite frankly, we didn't realize. $3,500 for a radio receiver was a lot of money then. And the point being that we didn't understand is that the money is just, they're awash in money for Watergate and the ancillary espionage and spying and sabotage operations they were conducting. And literally, he did not say, as people have pointed out, at least according to the notes, follow the money. But the essence of it was, this is about the money, and get your hooks into that. And so we started writing about the secret fund. One of our sources was the treasurer for the Nixon campaign, Hugh Sloan, who handed out all this money, who had quit, who was uneasy about what was going on, and the structure. And what's interesting in a story like this, particularly in retrospect, the structure you have is not, it's one you impose, and the secret fund became kind of who controls it and who are the people, and one of them was John Mitchell, and Carl should tell that story about that, because that was a remarkable moment. What is shocking in retrospect is you have the former Attorney General of the United States threatening the anatomy of the publisher of the Washington Post, and we ran the story, and there was kind of no press solidarity, no sense of what the hell's going on here. It was quite remarkable, and the remarkable part was also the silence by people. Oh, well, this is what happens. Well, it isn't what happens. It was quite clear that there were connections, and we were looking for the connections. The whole question was, what's this about? And Carl got that call from somebody saying, talk to a guy named Shipley in, Tennessee, or where, Alex Shipley. Carl tracked down Alex Shipley, who had worked in the Attorney General's office of one of the states, and he was recruited by somebody, or they tried to recruit him to do dirty tricks for the Nixon committee. And Carl wanted to write a story and found a couple of other people who'd been asked to do this but had not done it. And I said, it's thin. We don't know what this is. And this is when I contacted Mark Felt, and we had that meeting October 9th. And he said, look, it's all Watergate's a part of much more, a whole campaign of spying, sabotage, that there are 50 people like Donald Segretti out there. People thought that was preposterous. We ran it in the paper the next day, and people in the White House, like Len Garment, who've written books about this, said this is the story when somebody finally understood Watergate. Said the connective tissue here is not just spy passively, but hire people to go out and do dirty tricks. And it turns out when the Senate Watergate Committee looked at this, there were more than 50 people doing this. The megaphone was Ron Ziegler, and he just said, anonymous sources, a fountain of information, a fountain, his attacks were very specific. Anonymous sources, unreliable. Ben Bradlee is somebody who's a Kennedy Democrat, fountain of misinformation, and it was, you can't believe this. This is not true. And the reaction we had, I think, was one of alarm on one level, and on the other level, we knew we had good stories, good sources. There's clearly more here. And at one point, we did the story about the house cleaning at the committee to re-elect, where they destroyed documents, and Gordon Liddy, one of the Watergate leaders, was behind this. And so we felt some alarm. My God, this is the spokesman for the leader of the free world. And on the other hand, we're on solid ground. And there was never anybody saying, don't keep going on this story, don't keep working on it. When we were attacked by Ziegler, Clark McGregor, who was Nixon's campaign manager at that point, and Bob Dole, who was the chairman of the Republican National Committee, on one day when we did the story connecting the Segretti operation to Dwight Chapin, who was Nixon's appointment secretary. This took it right into the White House. And that's when we got both barrels, or 3 barrels, from the Nixon apparatus. And Harry Rosenfeld, the Metropolitan editor, was very concerned that night and was apoplectic about, are we sure? Have we got it? We've got to write a story about these attacks on us. It was a really intense moment, but again, it's regular order. Keep working on it. Ben encouraging, always vetting stories at the end, but not coming in and tampering with how that process worked. I don't think Ben had a lot of trust. I think Ben was, where's this coming from? Are you sure? Are you careful? And intuitively, I think he thought we were on the right track. He understood Nixon and that whole mentality, I think, quite well. The identity of Deep Throat, Ben didn't ask. It was all part of, we had other sources. Okay, I've, got this source in the Justice Department, and I had to felt was quite paranoid, to say the least, of meeting in an underground garage at 2 a.m. I was kind of new to this. I thought, okay, maybe that's typical. So it wasn't something that necessarily surprised me, but he was really all in on the idea of protecting his identity. And Ben didn't ask really until after Nixon resigned, as best I can call. He says he was astonished that he didn't ask. And if, of course, he'd asked, I would have told him. But I wasn't going to come in and say, by the way, so-and-so is risking a whole lot or maybe everything, and here's who it is, because, obviously secrets are not kept very well. And so I was protective about that. And I told Carl, because Carl needed to know. And, but it was, again, the mosaic of, and felt, except in a couple of cases, wasn't really forthcoming. That October 10th, 1972 story is the key to telling people, hey, this is a big thing. This is well funded. There are many tentacles out there. And as we got into it, you realize that the Nixon campaign and all the saboteurs and spies were quite effective. They really hurt Muskie, Senator Muskie, who was the front runner. And little things, big things, taking shoes from the hotel, taking keys from the car, turns out hired Muskie's chauffeur as a spy who would Xerox documents that were going between Muskie's headquarters, presidential campaign headquarters, and the Senate. And so once, again, this was months or actually years later, we learned this, but it all fit together, and it kind of made sense. What Nixon had done is declared war on the Democrats, and he, I don't know whether it's useful, but after decades, Carl and I wrote this piece for the Washington Post about the 5 wars of Watergate. And first was against the anti-war movement, which Nixon was just hyper about the anti-war movement, and it was causing him trouble, needless to say. But then they took the same people, and the second war was a war against the press, and 17 wiretaps of reporters, people in the White House. And the third war is take that Hunt-Liddy operation and move it to the Democrats. Then when they got caught in Watergate, the fourth war was the war against justice, the cover-up. And the fifth was Nixon's last war, which was the war against history, to say, oh no, this didn't happen this way, I didn't intend this. And of course the history is going to be written, or has been written, by those tapes where you see Nixon was the leader of the charge. What Felt was saying, the stakes are so high, lives could be in danger. This is in an underground parking garage. This is all of the paranoia that Alan Pakula captures in the movie version of All the President's Men is true, and it's just, he looks, lives are in danger, but then what he said is that everyone's involved. There are covert operations everywhere, which it wasn't until years later we learned the extent to which the CIA was involved in all kinds of activity. And so Carl and I told Carl about this, and Carl said, we've got to tell someone. Let's call Ben. And so in the middle of the night, and woke him up, went to his house on Dexter Street, and laid it out as what this is one of these cases where the movie version is a little exaggerated, where Jason Robards, after he's told this, says, well, go take a bath, get back to work, not much is in danger, just freedom of the press and the future of the country. And what happened, we told Ben this, and this is in our notes in All the President's Men, and actually Ben's answer is better and the good one and more honest. After learning all of this, Ben said, what the hell do we do now? Because you wouldn't give a speech about the First Amendment at that moment. Then, very practical, what the hell do we do now? And then we met, and I think in retrospect, I think it was a little bit my paranoia, the sense of, yeah, the stakes are that high. I don't think our lives were in danger. But as we later learned, Howard Hunt and Gordon Liddy tried to kill Jack Anderson, or developed a plan to kill the columnist Jack Anderson. So it was not outside the boundaries of what they might do. There was a lot of worry. They brought in people to check our phones at the Post, and I know at my apartment and Carl's, and they didn't find anything. But that, that didn't make you feel comfortable about it. It was the whole thing. Ben said at one point, you go home with a lump in your stomach. And that's true. And there were lots of nights with lumps in your stomach because what does this mean? Where's it going? Are we exceeding the bounds of normal journalism? Are we absolutely sure we didn't have video or tapes at that point? So we're in truly what he always called the uncharted waters. A real important turning point was the Haldeman mistakes we made, which really did, but this tells you a lot about Ben, because who controls this secret fund? We named 4 people, including John Mitchell, including Nixon's personal lawyer, Herbert Kalmbach, turned out was handing out all this money for the cover-up and for dirty tricks operations. But the 5th name was Bob Haldeman. And we thought we had nailed it because Hugh Sloan, the treasurer, seemed okay with the idea of us writing the story based on Sloan's grand jury testimony. So he said, Haldeman's controlling this fund, the 5th person according to Hugh Sloan's grand jury testimony. Well, it was wrong. And turned out Haldeman was controlling the fund. He had his own fund. It turned out, we learned many months later, $350,000, and that's what he went to jail for. But we had the attribution. Sloan had never testified to that, and the reason he'd never testified to that, they'd never asked him. The inquiry, the official investigation by the U.S. Attorney's Office and the grand jury was to prove that it was an isolated operation, 5 burglars, Howard Hunt and Gordon Liddy, and that's the case they put on in the first trial. No higher-ups involved, and but that was Ziegler blasted us, and under that pressure, Ben memorably said, "We stand by the story." And he interrogated us to find out where we'd made the mistake, and Mark Felt later said, "Oh, it's a Haldeman operation. We put that," which now you look at the tapes, you look at all of this, and was a Nixon operation conceived by Nixon and executed by Haldeman, the whole thing. And of course, we didn't know that. We thought we should resign, that how did this happen? We, in a way I'm not proud of, Carl's not proud of, we went to an FBI person who had, we thought, confirmed this and confronted him in a way that was, I'm embarrassed that in the moment, in the pressure, the sense of we've really screwed up, to go to somebody who'd been a source like that was unforgivable in my view. This was instinct. This was kind of, we're on the right track here. This is what we do. Now that you look back decades later at this, it was almost foreordained, a given that we would make a big mistake. Because what it did, this was 2 weeks before the 72 election. It gave the White House, hey, look, this is all BS. You can't believe it. Sloan's attorney was out there saying he never gave that testimony. And so it is a great human lesson. And over the years, talked with Ben about this, about you're right, but you're wrong. And we were right, but we were wrong. And we were too eager, we were impatient, we were pressing the envelope. It's kind of, we knew this was the case, but we didn't know. We didn't have the evidence, and we made a giant mistake. It was one of those things that I was as depressed and angry myself, I think, as I've ever been. And it was a failure of method. An important moment is in January '73. We'd written these stories. Nixon's reelected. People didn't believe him. It was a kind of, where's this going? Where are we going? Senator Ervin called me up and wanted our sources, said he's going to head a Senate Watergate investigation. And I said, we can't give our sources. He said, we're going to do it anyway. Maybe we'll find that the deputy campaign manager was involved. And this investigation was approved by the Senate 77-0. Dozens of Republicans voted to investigate their Republican president. Astonishing. And I don't think we realized the significance of it. And it turned out lots of Republicans knew enough about Nixon to have suspicions. It would be almost impossible to not have suspicions about Nixon. The Senate Watergate Committee is the gold standard of Senate congressional investigations. They got testimony from everyone. John Dean, Nixon's White House counsel, turned against Nixon and gave days of detailed testimony about Nixon's involvement. Dean was such a potent witness, in many ways equivalent to the tapes, because he did what the tapes couldn't do. He said, I met with Nixon, we had these conversations. Our motive, my motive, was to obstruct justice, was illegal. And so you have the intent established. On all the tapes, Nixon never says, oh, my intent is to break the law. He just says, stonewall, lie. It's clear, but Dean was a potent witness. And then so that was June 1973. In July, Carl and I had close relations with the Senate Watergate Committee lawyers and staff. And after Dean testified, the question was, is he telling the truth? And what evidence corroborates or contradicts what he has said? So they did a full inquiry to what they called satellite witnesses. And one of the investigators said to me, who should we talk to? And I said, well, and there was an obvious list. But there's a guy named Alexander Butterfield, who Hugh Sloan had told us was in charge of internal security, which meant wiretapping, really. And I'd gone to Butterfield's house, and he wouldn't talk to me, or to somebody, the drapes opened, closed, or peeped. And so I said, Butterfield. So they called Butterfield. And Butterfield went through a real kind of, what do I do? Should I testify? Had a moral choice to make, he had a legal choice, he had a personal choice. And they called him in, and he was the one who had supervised the installation of the taping system, all at Nixon's direction. And he told the investigators, it was a Friday, I think it was July 13th, 1973, about this secret taping system. Well, I got calls saying, you won't believe it, Nixon bugged himself. And it was, is this possible? What's the threshold of dealing with the inconceivable in Watergate? There's got to be something that's, it made sense, but it didn't make sense. Seemed impossible. So that's Friday. Friday night. Saturday, I'm stewing about this. What should I do? Carl was, I think, out of town. And so at 9 o'clock at night, Saturday night, I called Ben. And I think I woke him up, frankly. And maybe he was with Sally, who knows? I didn't know. And said, Nixon taped everything. There was a secret taping system. And of presumably all these conversations that Dean has testified to. And Ben was skeptical, reluctant. So what do you think? I said, don't bust one on it. Overall, what's he said? It's a B+. Okay, B+, don't bust one. So I took Sunday off, and Monday they called Butterfield as this surprise witness. And there is the memorable question, did you know about taping systems? And Butterfield, in that kind of former Air Force colonel, direct, perfect posture, said yes. And it was one of those things, it was like an electric current going through Washington, the newsroom, and Ben, to his credit, came by and knocked on my desk and said, "Okay, it's better than a B plus." Of course, the tapes came out very slowly, and there was a batch, and then there was a batch that the Watergate prosecutor wanted. Finally, the Supreme Court said yes. I mean, that's a whole other chapter in this. I mean, there are chapters and chapters, and the Nixon released edited transcripts of the tapes, and some of them were out through the impeachment investigation, and again, it was part. But one of the themes here is the cover-up was so clumsy and stupid, and not managed with kind of the precision that you would expect given the stakes. And then when you heard some of those tapes and saw transcripts, I mean, I've spent too much time listening to these things because it's astonishing, and it's the extent to which Nixon used the presidency as an instrument of personal revenge. Get the IRS on these people, get this, get that, the CIA cover up, which ended his presidency when that tape finally came out at the end. And the Nixon orchestration, the Nixon anger and hate is astonishing. The final tape came out that Monday, August 5th, and Carl and I did a long story about how the tape showed he had ordered bringing the CIA to call off the FBI, clear obstruction of justice. It was, again, I try to be as unemotional as possible and just kind of, okay, now look what happened. That night of the resignation, we knew he was going to resign. Ben did go around to everyone, said, no gloating. Be real, no gloating. And I think he really felt that. And after Nixon's speech, he and I were going to the elevator to go down to get something to eat or a cup of coffee or something like that. And the elevator opened, and there's Sergeant Shriver, the embodiment of the Kennedy legacy. And Peace Corps director, was what was it? He was married to Eunice Kennedy, Jack Kennedy's sister, and somebody Ben knew really well. And the elevator opens, and out jumps Sergeant Shriver. Ben, no, I just couldn't. I couldn't be happier. I just had to come. And Ben was just poker-faced. This was the worst thing that happened, that somehow a politician like Sergeant Shriver was coming in and kind of embracing this as an important political moment. Ben wanted to have nothing to do with that. He wanted to get down there and make sure we got the paper out and explain this as well as we can. And I think he was in awe and shocked about the moment and the sequence, which of course he had lived. What was important? The Republicans. The Republicans and the impeachment, 6 or 7 of them on the Judiciary Committee voted to recommend Nixon's impeachment. That was astonishing. In the end, it was Barry Goldwater who turned against Nixon and told Carl and myself, had us up to read his diary after Nixon resigned. And the meeting with Nixon the day before Nixon announced his resignation, Goldwater said, you know, you're going to be impeached in the House and the Senate conviction. That vote, you're only going to get 4 or 5 votes. And then Goldwater said, and one of them's not mine. And that was the end. And Ben had this pipeline to Goldwater, and Goldwater was saying, don't write that he's going to resign. Don't, be careful. If you make it clear he's going to resign, then maybe he won't. But I always thought that relationship with Goldwater was proof that Ben was not an ideologue in any way. That Goldwater was the conscience of the conservative Republican Party, and that Ben and he could have this relationship, and that Goldwater was one of the people who turned on Nixon in a way that Nixon could never recover from. Sam Ervin said it best. What was Watergate about? It was about the lust for political power, the uncontainable drive, the unmanageable drive by Nixon to retain power in '72. But the day Nixon resigned, I think he said it himself. Fascinating moment covered on live television, his farewell to the staff, his friends in the East Room of the White House. And this was a speech Nixon gave, no notes, unscripted. He was sweating, talked about his mother and his father, and he was just so, it was a psychiatric hour on live television. And then he kind of waved his hand, and this is why I called you here. And he said, I think the most memorable line from Nixon ever, which is, always remember, others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them, and then you destroy yourself. He got it. Hate was the piston that drove him. It was an organizing principle. Get so-and-so, screw so-and-so. They're political enemies. There are no boundaries in the law or good judgment or good taste. And that was the poison, hate. And again, bring in the panel of 10 psychiatrists. At the moment he's leaving the presidency, he gets it, and he says it. And it's too late. He can't say, I understand what happened, I'm going to stay. It was over, and he realized that, and he realized what a lesson for politicians, kids, humans, anyone, about we've all had deep contempt or hate for somebody or something, and don't nurture it. Don't act on it. Don't let it drive you. Why? Because it will destroy you. The lesson for journalism, which is what Ben cared about, is keep going after the story. Keep digging. And he was not a philosophical person about, his writings and speeches, Ben's writings and speeches about this are about truth. And that the remedy for politicians, for humans, for journalists is the truth. And he thought that once you go down that path of untruths, the truth will emerge. Carl Bernstein and I tried many times through intermediaries, through letters, through lawyers to talk to Nixon. And Nixon always said no. We never talked to him. And that's understandable. We weren't doing it in a way to pester him. It was if he wanted to say something to us, but he was quite angry at us, and he's allowed that anger as far as I'm concerned. Well, it was Redford who got onto it and decided to make it, and Ben had the approach avoidance of, oh, wow, this is interesting. Oh, wait a minute, stay off the stage, as he used to say. And so he was ambivalent about it. This story, I think, is important about him and about what it means to be editor of the Post. Redford and Hoffman and Alan Pakula, the director, are sitting around saying, we have to get somebody to play Bradlee. And Redford knew Jason Robards, and the similarity between them is spooky. And this is 1975. Robards is at the bottom of his career, had been in an automobile accident, had drinking problem. So they called him in and said, we'll pay you $50,000 to play Ben Bradlee. Robards, $50,000, wow, this is a windfall. So give me the script, took it home, came back in and said, I can't play Bradlee. Pakula, why? And Robert said, well, I read the script. Well, what's wrong with the script? Well, all Bradlee does is run around and say, where's the fucking story? And Pakula said, that's what the executive editor of the Washington Post does. That's his job. Robards, And then they said, all you have to do is find 15 different ways to say, where's the fucking story? Oh, okay, I get it. And in the movie, you see Robards finding those 15 ways to say, where's the fucking story? That he can't do the reporting for you. All he has to do, he's an agitator. He is somebody to inspire the reporters. He's somebody to ask the question, but underneath it all is, where's the story? Get the story. Find out to my satisfaction. And I think that realization explains the massive power an editor of the Washington Post has, but also the limitations that he has to, or she has to, be out there listening, prodding, encouraging, being stern when necessary, but always be on the prowl. And Ben was on the prowl for a good story, as best I could tell, 24/7, except for the time he told me the taping system was only a B+ story. There was a spotlight, but Ben kind of preferred to, again, with this approach avoidance, yes, and no. And because he knew better. He knew that we belonged off stage, but he loved lots of it. His whole relationship, marriage with Sally, became defining to his life and that whole persona. I want to tell the story of, this is 2011. So Ben is at the last part of his life. And we got a request to come to the Nixon Library to be interviewed by the director, Tim Neftali. And I called Ben and told him about this, and he was, the Nixon Library? They want us? And I said, yeah. And he was kind of, wow, this, I mean, it was one of his favorite lines. Think about this for a minute. It's gone from enemy to now we are being asked to come. So we arranged to fly out together from Washington and went to the airport and going through TSA security. And Ben had no photo ID because he didn't have a driver's license at that point in his life. He didn't bring his passport. And so he got out his AARP card, tattered, torn, showed it to the guy, said, you know, no photo ID, retired person association card isn't going to cut it. And so we're not going to be able to make the flight to get there. And then, so we're stumped. And then all of a sudden we hear this voice. And it's the voice of Moses. And in this case, Moses was Vernon Jordan, the African-American, large fixture in Washington, had been head of the Urban League, political player like no one else. And so Vernon steps forward, goes to the head of that TSA unit, and he says, brother, this is Ben Bradlee, the former editor of the Washington Post. And the guy, Ben Bradlee, waves him through on his AARP card. And Ben gets through the scanner and everything and turns around to me and goes, the fist, made it again, beat the system. No one can, interfere. And I thought of that as, that's the Bradlee. That is, and so we went to the library, and we were interviewed, and they just loved it. And Ben was just so kind of disbelieving almost. He enjoyed beating the system because, in a sense, all of journalism, all of really good journalism is beating the system because the system doesn't want you to know. And the most important thing about Ben is the Post would do stories, we'd do stories, and I'd do stories, and they'd be good, they'd be fine, and there's kind of an atmosphere of high five, of we've really done it. But what Ben knew is you had to find the really good stories. You had to know what matters, what is essential to dig into, that you have to be able to separate the kind of fine stories, good, everyone's happy, from the few, from the handful, where you have gone to the absolute core of what's going on. He once said to me, that happens a couple of times in a career. And I think he's right. And the capacity to not be overwhelmed, to not drown in the routine, but to say, you know, we got to really go for the big one here. We got to keep working. We've got to not give up. There is that, he had that extra layer, that extra knowledge of sometimes things weren't just journalism. Sometimes things defined a moment in history, an era, and what you want to do is grab them. You don't know. And that is the important practical lesson. Okay, something happens and you go at it. You try to find out. You dig into it. You don't give up. But no one in the morning of one of the Watergate stories said, this is going to be one of the most important days of your life. No one, you don't get that message. So you do it. And you then sometimes there's that payoff. But you have to, you can't, again, this is the method. Talk to everyone. Go back. Surround the story. Do it in a way that is just not routine. And that was the running room that he provided on Watergate and lots of other stories. At this moment, Carl and I had done The Final Days, which was the second Nixon book, which was just coming out at that point and showed what it was like, the turmoil and anguish of Nixon's last year, and the legal battles for the tapes and the concealments to people who were close to him, to his lawyers, the whole dance to get him out of office. Al Haig, his chief of staff's worry that Nixon might take his own life in despair and so forth. So that book was just coming out, and so of course the Bradlee lesson is get your ass out of here and get back to work. What have you got for me tomorrow? So that the movie was, for me, momentary, and I think Ben treated it that way. Yes, it's part of his resume. It's there. He's Jason Robards. Jason Robards wins Best Supporting Actor for playing Bradlee, rightly so, in my view. But what's the lesson? Move on. What have you got for me tomorrow? And I think I was working on a couple of stories. So that, you know, that's what's the final lesson have been, the joy of work and the joy of journalism. He entered the stage, contrary to his own advice, and he used it. He knew it gave that he was the editor of the Post leverage and a presence, and but I think for him, in the discussions I have, what are you working on? What do you got? What's going on in this administration? What's the next book? Move on. We know. I don't think we ever had this conversation directly, but there were so many people in Washington who never move on. And his lesson to Carl and myself was, you know, this is nose down, ass up, moving continually forward. I was not a good editor, and I was impatient with people. I'm a reporter, and one of my mistakes is not to learn from Ben, which is to be engaged but not over-engaged. That you can't, I would second guess reporters. Did you talk to this person? Did you do that? I just was not good at it. And we had the Janet Cooke incident, failure on my part, which was a big blow and a mistake. And instead of throwing me over the side, which he could have done, he rescued me. Janet Cooke was this young black reporter that we hired, lots of talent, good writer, and she made up a story about an 8-year-old heroin addict, allegedly, and we ran it. I supported it. Some people were skeptical about her and about the story, and I didn't listen carefully enough. And 42-paragraph story won a Pulitzer Prize. And again, somebody from, I think, the Cleveland paper discovered that she had not gone to Vassar, as she said, and that unraveled the whole thing, and she finally acknowledged it, and it was a massive wound for everyone at the Post. Ben, in particular, myself in particular, I was the Metro editor supervising that, and what Ben did, he got the ombudsman to do a full investigation, one of the great internal investigations done, and it was no excuse. We'd screwed up. I screwed up, and I only talked to Ben about this once, but it was many years later. I finally concluded that not only was it a journalistic failure, but it was a moral failure. That here we had a story about an unidentified 8-year-old who was being shot up by the boyfriend and the mother with heroin, essentially killing this boy. And we worried about the journalism and not the boy. And Ben has children. I, at that point, had one daughter. And if you learn that a child is being abused and essentially murdered, you have an obligation to do something about it. And what I should have done is called the police. I should have insisted we find out who this was and where. Drop a dime. We could still do the story, save the kid. But I was oblivious to the kid. And that kid, suppose we'd learned the kid was being tortured to death. It would have been obvious to call the police, right? But I didn't get it and didn't do that. Now, if I'd done what I think is the human responsibility to help a child that's being abused, allegedly, if I'd done that, I would have insisted, where is this kid? Who is this kid? We're going to help this kid. We're going to get a doctor and the police, or mainly a doctor. If I'd done that, it would have exposed the journalistic fraud. And there would have been no Jimmy. And it's a very powerful moral lesson if you follow it through, that as a reporter, yes, you have responsibility to journalism, but if you're going down the street covering something and somebody starts beating somebody up, killing them, you're going to intervene, and then you'll write the story. But you can't stand on the sidelines, particularly with a child. And I stood on the sidelines and never quite have unraveled why, where were the human instincts which should have driven me to saved the child, and there would have been no Jimmy scandal. Talked to Ben about that, and he agreed many years later. He said, I see that point, but that's the big lesson. Jimmy, take journalism seriously, focus on it, but if a human being is in danger and you can intervene, particularly with the child, 8-year-old, this was supposedly an 8-year-old, easy call. Moral failure. I think lots of things blinded us, and this was after Watergate. There was that sense of, we can dig into anything. There were people who said, yeah, something like this could happen. This is where Janet Cooke got the idea from people saying, we've heard there was, children are being made into addicts and so forth, but there was no witness. No firsthand evidence, the ultimate lesson of journalism, and so she made it up. She became the witness, and I think it was a heady time, and the mayor said, oh yeah, we know who the kid is, and there were all kinds of things to kind of take us off the hook. We thought so, and stupid. The police and the mayor was involved, and we were haughty. We were kind of, hey, we're not going to say who or where or what he is. And a lack of thorough kind of blocking and tackling reporting, and a moral failure of, hey, we can save this kid or help this kid. Yeah, he was crushed. But his instinct took him to get Bill Green to do that no excuses investigation, and he hung us all out, and rightly so. And then Ben ran it on the front page. And his only order in that was he wanted to make sure nothing came out later that wasn't in Bill Green's story. During this period, after the expose of the fraud, I went to Don on a Sunday night at his home and said, I think I should resign. This really is my fault. I'm kind of the reporting guy. And Don said, well, if you resign, then Ben has to resign. If Ben has to resign, I have to resign. And I don't want to resign. It's that simple. Okay. Because, again, the strength of the institution was demonstrated by, it's collective guilt, everyone up, hey, I screwed up, and remorseful, and okay, we did it to ourselves, shame on us, and I think in an odd way, this made the Post stronger. I had an offer from CBS, and he wrote me a letter, a personal letter, confidential. Dear Bob, a light will go out in this place forever if and when you leave. And then he said he was going to set up this investigative unit, which he did, and we still have it, and he, it was just kind of, you'll have a staff, you'll, stay here. But then this is the part of the story that never gets told. And he then had Don Graham, the publisher, take me to lunch. And Don was, as Don always is, very, you always work here, you're you're part of this institution, all the kind of laying it on very thick. But then he said, and I always suspected, I never asked Don this, but I think Ben put Don up to this. Then Don said, you know, we're close and we can be honest with each other. You're not going to be good at CBS. You are not good on television. And I thought is that, and you know, he was kind of, I'm just telling you, you know, you're thinking about doing something you're not going to be good at. And I think I was not going to leave after I got Ben's letter, but I thought that was a kind of artful dagger that right to the kind of, gee, I play hockey and I'm thinking of switching to basketball and I'm 4'2", which is essentially what Don told me. At least with me, he was never harsh. When we screwed up on Watergate, when the Janet Cooke thing, he just kind of, you know, as he said in his memoirs, I'm interested in the whatness of something, not the rightness or wrongness. What happened? Then when you untangle it, there was no kind of retribution. There was no, and this became so clear to me. It was 1984. I did a book on John Belushi, the actor's drug overdose death, book called Wired. And I was out promoting it. And it was Diane Sawyer who worked for CBS, then got me in a room with the cameras going to talk about Belushi and drugs and so forth. I think for an hour and a half for some, you know, 2-minute clip. And she got me loose. And I said, oh, cocaine, you know, it's everywhere. She said, oh, at the Washington Post? And I had heard from Tom Zito, who's a style reporter, not necessarily a reliable witness, said that there are more than 40 people who use cocaine at the Washington Post. So I said this. There are more than 40 people who use cocaine at the Washington Post. First rule, never use numbers. Never, and I said, well, I don't know that I've heard this, but this, you know, I kind of gave it authenticity by stating it. And of course, then CBS did it. The little 2-minute clip was about me saying, there are all these people who use cocaine. And of course, Ben saw this or heard of it. You know, it was kind of, Woodward, you know, get your ass in here. What have you done? And I said, oh, I'm sorry. You know, she got me, and you know, it's my technique. Sit with somebody for hour and a half, and let them kind of say things that maybe they shouldn't. And I'm really sorry, you know, and what was interesting, he gave me amnesty, a pardon, said, okay, you know, Christ, you idiot. But there's no penalty. There's no kind of, it was a gesture of brotherly affection almost, of, oh my God, you know, I've got, and then so he issued a statement, I don't know about anyone who uses cocaine. If I do, they're out of here, and, you know, big kind of, and I thought that kind of, it's hard to forgive. And he was capable of forgiving in a way that was kind of, you idiot, but, and how could you do this? But, okay, move on. Nose down, ass up, move forward. What have you got for tomorrow, almost? I don't think he literally said it at that moment. But there's not a lot of forgiveness. And Ben actually was a forgiving person. Lots of people on the staff, people close to him, screwed up. Well, I think it was the curiosity. I mean, he's the master of curiosity, and people say he had a short attention span. He did if something bored him. If something didn't bore him, then the lights went on, and you got the full Bradlee attention. I think he remained curious. I think he remained open. The sub-theme in all of this is they're doing things in the government that they're not telling you about that may be screwing you or screwing the population, and he was suspicious and doubtful, and I guess that carried him. But you know, it's a great mystery why some people. I mean, he retired at age 70, yeah, and lived for another 2 decades plus, and I think no doubt Sally kept him energized and relevant. That was a real love affair, and she ran his life. I hear him on the phone. Hey, Sal, what are we doing tonight? He had no idea what they were doing, any night really, and she controlled it, and it kept him going. I think he cared deeply about this country. I think it's a difficult word to use, patriot. I think he was a patriot. I don't think he had rules. I think he had to play it as he always said, you play the hand that's dealt you, and this guy comes in with this stuff before he goes to Jack Anderson, and you know, these things, not to over dramatize, but to not understate, these are the sort of things in the Cold War that would have allowed us to do certain things that would have almost be unimaginable, and if there were a war, to give us an edge that people didn't know about. It's the equivalent in World War II of breaking Enigma, the Nazi code, to put it simply. Oh, he loved being dangerous. That was part of it all, you know. We're going to find out, or we're going to try to find out. So that perfectly fits the description. It was dangerous for people who were hiding things. We haven't talked about Vietnam really, but Vietnam and Watergate and 1-2 punch to make you very skeptical. And I don't think he used that language with me, but I think the message was, be dangerous.